Whispers of five tongues. The marble floors glistened under the chandeliers, reflecting the golden light that gave the conference hall its almost theatrical glow. The annual Business Leader Summit was not just an event. It was a stage where power dressed itself in designer suits and spoke in the language of stock prices, profit margins, and investment portfolios. Every detail screamed wealth. Every handshake carried a dollar sign. And somewhere in that vast display of luxury, a young woman pushed a cart filled with rags, sprays, and a dented mop bucket. Her name was Elena Martinez. 19 years old, shoulders square with quiet determination, she walked as though invisible, which was precisely how most guests preferred to see her. She wore the hotel's plain uniform, navy blue with a stitch patch that read service staff. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple braid, and her hands, calloused from years of helping her father, gripped the mop handle tightly. She shouldn't have been here tonight. This was her father's shift. But the man who had never once missed a day of work in nearly 20 years lay in bed with a fever that refused to break. When he tried to rise earlier, coughing so hard his chest ached, Elena pressed her hands on his shoulders and whispered firmly, "Rest, Papa. I'll cover for you. Just this once." And so she came, determined to honor him. The grand ballroom was packed with men and women whose shoes alone cost more than her father earned in a month. She moved silently along the edge of the room, sweeping crumbs, gathering abandoned glasses, her eyes always down. But destiny has a way of ambushing those who least expect it. Near the back of the hall, a cluster of executives gathered around a tall, silver-haired man who radiated authority, Richard Lawson, a name that rolled off newspapers like a brand. His empire of real estate towers touched skylines from Chicago to Dubai. His laugh, loud and confident, could fill a room before his words ever did. People orbited him, eager for proximity, like planets circling the sun. "Success," Richard was saying, his glass of champagne raised high, "doesn't come from books or speeches. It comes from understanding one language, and that language is money." The group erupted in laughter, nodding as though his words were scripture. Elena paused only for a moment, balancing a tray of empty cups. She wasn't sure if it was pride or exhaustion that made her glance up, but Richard noticed. His sharp eyes, trained to spot hesitation in billion-dollar negotiations, locked on hers. "You," he said suddenly, pointing his glass like a weapon. "The young lady in uniform. Tell us, what language do you speak?" The crowd's laughter grew. It was a cruel kind of amusement, the kind that thrives when power mocks the powerless. Elena's pulse hammered in her ears. Every instinct told her to bow her head, apologize, and walk away. But something in her refused to shrink. She straightened her back, the tray trembling only slightly in her grip. Her voice, when it came, was calm and unwavering. "I speak 5 languages." For half a second, silence. Then the laughter roared louder, echoing off the high ceilings like a storm. 5. Richard smirked, leaning back with theatrical disbelief. "And yet here you are, mopping floors." The word stung like a slap, but Elena did not flinch. Her father had taught her that dignity is not something anyone can take. It's something you surrender. She would not surrender tonight. "Yes, sir," she replied evenly, "because my father is sick and I am working his shift. But languages are not chains." She set the tray down gently on a nearby table. "They are wings." The laughter faltered. A few faces in the crowd softened with surprise. Richard's smirk lingered, but there was a flicker, so brief most would miss it, of unease in his eyes. He raised his glass again, trying to dismiss the moment. "Wings," he repeated, chuckling as though savoring the irony. "Well, my dear, let us hope they fly you somewhere beyond, cleaning up after the rest of us." Polite laughter returned, but weaker now, uncertain. Elena bowed her head slightly, not in shame but in quiet defiance, and returned to her work. Yet inside her something stirred. She had spoken the truth of her heart in front of those who would never otherwise listen. And Richard Lawson, who had built his fortune believing money was the only language worth learning, found himself oddly unsettled. Her words clung to him like a song he couldn't forget. For the first time in years, Richard Lawson realized he had been silenced by someone no one in that room considered important, and the janitor's daughter walked away, her mop in hand, unaware that she had just lit a fuse that would soon explode across both their lives. The night after the summit's laughter, Elena returned home past midnight. The apartment was small, 2 cramped rooms in a building whose paint had long surrendered to time. She placed her father's work shoes neatly by the door before tiptoeing into the bedroom where he lay, fevered but resting. A damp cloth cooled his forehead, and for the first time in hours, his breathing seemed steady. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, watching a man whose hands were rougher than sandpaper, but whose heart was gentler than any she had ever known. Carlos Martinez had arrived in America with little more than a duffel bag, and the promise that he would build a better life for his family. For years he had scrubbed floors, polished banisters, and cleaned the remnants of other people's wealth without ever once resenting his work. This job, he always said, isn't small. Every job has dignity if you give it your best. It was his mantra, spoken so often Elena could hear it even now as she stared at his sleeping figure. She tightened the blanket around him and whispered, "I made you proud tonight, Papa. At least I tried." But the memory of laughter from the conference hall burned in her chest. Elena's mother had left when she was only 6. She barely remembered her, except for a faint scent of jasmine that lingered in her earliest memories. From then on, it had always been Elena and her father, 2 against the world. While other children played soccer after school, Elena sat in the corner of the library, her backpack stuffed with notebooks and her imagination soaring far beyond the walls of their neighborhood. It began innocently. She discovered a shelf of language books. French at first. She copied words, repeated phrases, and whispered them as she cleaned the apartment. Soon, she added Spanish, her father's mother tongue, which she perfected through their nightly conversations. Then came German, its sharp sounds challenging her, forcing her to wrestle with grammar. Portuguese followed, picked up from neighbors down the block who taught her lullabies and phrases over borrowed cups of sugar. Finally, Japanese, learned from endless nights watching free lessons online, repeating syllables until her tongue grew sore. Her friends teased her. "What's the point?" they asked. "Nobody's hiring people like us to speak French or Japanese." But Elena didn't learn for a job. She learned because every new word was a window. Every language gave her a passport to a world she had never touched. By 17, she could hold conversations with tourists in the city, sometimes shocking them by switching fluidly between tongues. An elderly couple from Berlin once pressed $10 into her hand after she guided them through the subway, saying, "You speak better than some of our own grandchildren." She carried those moments quietly, like jewels hidden in her pocket. Now, the laughter from the summit replayed in her mind. Richard Lawson's mocking tone, the smirks of the people around him. It should have crushed her, but instead it sparked something different. Anger, yes, but beneath the anger, a fire, if money was the only language Richard Lawson respected. Then perhaps it was time to prove that knowledge, persistence, and dignity spoke louder than wealth. Across town, Richard Lawson sat in his penthouse office that same night, pouring himself another glass of scotch. He had long forgotten the names of half the people he had insulted in his life. But not this girl, not the janitor's daughter. He kept hearing her words. Languages are not chains. They are wings. It irritated him, almost like a riddle he couldn't solve. He told himself it was foolish. Why should he, a man worth hundreds of millions, care what a cleaning girl said? But the truth gnawed at him. He remembered his own youth, when he was nothing more than a construction worker's son, who sold newspapers after school. Back then, people had laughed at him too. He had buried those memories under layers of wealth and arrogance. And now, in one sentence, a 19-year-old girl had unearthed them again. The next morning, Elena woke early to prepare breakfast for her father before school. He insisted she shouldn't take another shift at the hotel, but Elena only smiled. "You taught me to finish what we start." That day, as she walked class, she replayed the moment in the ballroom. She didn't regret speaking up. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Richard Lawson hadn't forgotten either. By the second day of the summit, whispers spread among the attendees. Lawson had been overheard saying, "If that girl truly speaks 5 languages, let her prove it, publicly." The challenge was set, and Elena, unknowingly, was about to step into a spotlight brighter and harsher than she had ever imagined. The second day of the summit buzzed with nervous energy. Deals were being whispered in hallways, contracts drafted over coffee, and fortunes negotiated over casual smiles. Yet beneath the surface, something unusual stirred. A rumor. The janitor's daughter. 5 languages, they say. Lawson is going to test her. Elena heard none of this as she entered through the service doors with her cart. She only knew she had another long evening ahead, covering for her father. Her uniform still smelled faintly of bleach, her hands still red from scrubbing. She kept her head low, reminding herself to move quietly, unseen. But Richard Lawson had other plans. When the afternoon session broke into networking, he seized a microphone with his usual charisma. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "last night we witnessed an amusing claim. A young lady among us, our very own staff, announced that she speaks 5 languages." Heads turned. Murmurs spread. Elena froze near the back wall, a cloth in her hand. Richard's eyes swept the crowd until they found her. "Come forward, Miss Martinez." Her heart hammered so loudly she thought the entire hall could hear it. The crowd parted as she walked, her uniform a stark contrast against the tailored suits and glittering dresses. She stood beside Richard, her palms damp, her throat tight. Richard smiled, but it was the smile of a man sharpening a blade. "Now then, words are cheap. Let's see if your wings can truly fly." From the audience, he beckoned a distinguished guest, Monsieur Lefebvre, a French investor whose company specialized in luxury goods. "Would you be so kind as to greet our young lady?" Lefebvre chuckled and approached, his accent thick. "Bonjour, mademoiselle. Comment allez-vous?" Without hesitation, Elena replied smoothly, "Je vais très bien, merci. Et vous?" Votre présentation si matin était fascinant. "I'm very well, thank you. And you?" "Your presentation this morning was fascinating." The room hushed. Lefebvre's eyebrows shot up in delight. "Mais c'est incroyable. Parfaitement dit." Whispers rippled through the audience. Richard's smile faltered, just slightly. He waved another guest forward, Mariana Silva, a Brazilian entrepreneur. "Perhaps Portuguese?" Mariana grinned, folding her arms. "Você realmente fala minha língua?" "Do you really speak my language?" "Claro." Elena answered warmly. "Aprendi com vizinhos que esse tornará minha segunda família. Esse projeto de energia renovável é inspirador." "Of course. I learned from neighbors who became my second family. Your renewable energy project is inspiring." Gasps. Mariana laughed with delight. "She's fluent." The crowd leaned forward. "Hungry now." Richard's jaw tightened. He motioned to another man, Herr Klein, a German executive. "Guten Abend, Fräulein." Klein greeted skeptically. "Guten Abend, Herr Klein." Elena responded in crisp German. Unternehmen Werner die Art und Weiss. We were stat bauen. Es ist ein Error, Sie kennenlernen. "Good evening, Mr. Klein. Your company is changing the way we build cities. It's an honor to meet you." Applause erupted, scattered at first, then growing. Richard's smirk had disappeared completely. And then, from the back, a voice called out, "Can you speak Japanese too?" All eyes turned as Mr. Sato, a Japanese investor, stepped forward. Richard had not arranged this. His stomach dropped. Elena hesitated for the briefest moment, then bowed respectfully. "Yes, I can speak a little. It is an honor to meet you. I have studied the history of your company." Mr. Sato beamed, nodding with approval. "Wonderful." The hall erupted into cheers and applause. Some guests even stood, clapping for the janitor's daughter who had just silenced the most powerful man in the room. Elena stood frozen in the middle of it all, her face flushed, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. She was seen, truly seen. Richard forced a laugh, but the sound was hollow. He raised his glass again, muttering, "Well then, Perhaps I underestimated you. But his eyes betrayed something deeper, unease, maybe even fear. Because in front of hundreds of witnesses, his empire of arrogance had been cracked by a girl in a janitor's uniform. Elena bowed her head slightly, not out of submission, but out of quiet respect for the moment. Inside, her fire burned brighter than ever. She hadn't just offended herself. She had proven that wings, once spread, could never be folded again. And Richard Lawson, for all his wealth, had no words left. The applause still echoed in Elena's ears as she returned to her cart, her legs trembling beneath her. She wanted to vanish into the shadows again, but the eyes of the entire hall followed her. For one brief, dazzling moment, she had been more than a janitor's daughter. She had been undeniable. But Richard Lawson was not a man who accepted defeat. Later that evening, when the guests gathered again for cocktails, Richard raised his voice above the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we all declare this girl a prodigy, let us not be so naive." The laughter that had once supported him was more hesitant now, but people still leaned in. Richard had built his fortune on charisma and dominance. He knew how to turn a crowd. "She may know a few rehearsed phrases," he continued, his smile sharp. "But fluency? Depth? I think not. Anyone can memorize a handful of sentences." All eyes shifted to Elena again. The warmth of applause turned cold, pressing against her chest like ice. Richard pointed directly at her. "Tell us honestly, young lady, are you simply parroting what you've memorized? Or do you truly understand these languages?" A hush fell. Elena's throat tightened. The weight of power tilted back toward Richard. She could almost feel the crowd slipping away from her, their admiration crumbling into doubt. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Every job has dignity if you give it your best." She stepped forward. "I don't memorize phrases," she said firmly. "I learn them the way I learned to survive, one word, one day at a time." Richard arched a brow. "And how? Pray tell. Does a janitor's daughter learn 5 languages with no tutors, no travel, and no money?" Her voice wavered for just a second, but she pressed on. "Because when other children played, I was in the library. Because when other families went on vacation, I stayed home with a notebook and an old laptop. Because while my father worked nights to put food on the table, I stayed awake listening to audiobooks, repeating words until my mouth hurt. Every accent, every syllable, I practiced until the neighbors laughed at me through the walls." She paused, her eyes locking with Richard's. "I learned because I refused to believe that poverty meant ignorance." The room was silent now. No clinking glasses, no nervous laughter, just silence. Richard's jaw tightened. He had expected fear, excuses, maybe even tears. But not this. Not strength. Elena pressed on, her courage growing with every word. "Languages are bridges. They connect us to people we would otherwise never understand. My father taught me that dignity is found in service, and I serve him by carrying his dream further than he ever could." Her voice softened. "If I clean floors, it's because I love the man who gave me everything he had. And if I speak languages, it's because I believe one day I will stand on a stage not to clean it, but to speak from it." The silence broke, not with laughter, but with applause. Real applause. Guests clapped, some rising to their feet, nodding in admiration. Richard's face hardened. He felt control slipping through his fingers. He raised his hand for calm, forcing a chuckle. Touching words, indeed, but passion does not pay bills. Dreams don't build empires. Money does. Before he could continue, a voice cut through the hall. "You're wrong." It came from Monsieur Lefebvre, the French investor. He stepped forward, eyes fixed on Elena. Passion, resilience, and knowledge are what build empires. Money is only the result. Another voice joined, Mariana Silva. "I built my company from nothing. I recognize myself in her. Talent like this is not to be mocked. It is to be invested in." Applause thundered again. Richard stood frozen, his authority crumbling under the weight of voices once loyal to him. Then, almost casually, Mariana turned to Elena. "When you're ready, I'd like to offer you an internship. We could use someone with your skills in Sao Paulo." The room gasped. Elena's heart leapt, her breath catching. An internship? In Brazil? It felt impossible. Unreachable. Yet here it was, offered like a key to a locked door. Richard's eyes narrowed. This was slipping too far. He leaned toward Elena, his voice low but biting. Careful, girl. Opportunities come with costs. Don't mistake pity for respect. But Elena did not shrink. She lifted her chin, her voice steady. Respect is not given. It's earned. Tonight I earn mine. The hall erupted again, this time not for Richard, but for her. And for the first time in decades, Richard Lawson felt something he had not felt since his youth, fear. Not of losing money, but of losing the illusion that money was the only language worth speaking. The breaking point had come, and it was not Elena's, it was his. The summit's final day arrived with the tension of a storm about to break. Guests still whispered about the janitor's daughter, their conversations drifting between admiration and disbelief. Some compared her to a spark in dry grass, small, unexpected, but capable of setting a forest aflame. Richard Lawson, however, sat in his suite staring at the skyline, his glass untouched. For the first time in years, he found no satisfaction in his reflection. The face that once radiated certainty now seemed to glare back at him with accusation. He told himself it was absurd. Why should a 19-year-old girl unsettle him? He had faced billion-dollar deals, courtroom battles, and cutthroat rivals. Yet Elena Martinez lingered in his mind like a stubborn melody he could not silence. It was her words. Languages are not chains. They are wings. The phrase gnawed at him because he recognized it. Not the words themselves, but the spirit behind them. Decades ago, he too had believed in wings. He had been a construction worker's son, chasing scholarships, reading borrowed books by flashlight when the electricity was cut off. He had once believed that resilience, not wealth, was a true currency of power. But somewhere along the way, he had traded wings for chains of gold. Across the city, Elena sat at the kitchen table beside her father, a letter of opportunity in her trembling hands. Mariana Silva had followed through an official internship offer, complete with housing and a stipend in Brazil. Her father coughed softly, folding the paper with careful hands. "You should go," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is your chance." Elena's throat tightened. "And leave you alone while you're sick? Papa, you need me." He smiled faintly, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "I needed you when you were a little girl. Now you need to fly." Tears pricked her eyes. It felt like being asked to choose between oxygen and water, both vital, both impossible to live without. At night, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, torn between duty and destiny. If she stayed, she would honor her father's sacrifice. If she left, she might build a life that could lift them both beyond survival. Meanwhile, Richard could not rest. He found himself in his car the next morning, instructing his driver to take him somewhere he had never intended to go, a working-class neighborhood where the Martinez family lived. The building was old, its bricks chipped, the windows patched with tape. Richard climbed the stairs, each step echoing like a reminder of the life he had buried. When Elena opened the door, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Mr. Lawson?" she whispered. He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. "May I speak with your father?" Inside, the small apartment smelled faintly of rice and cleaning supplies. Carlos Martinez sat propped against a pillow, thin but smiling warmly as Richard entered. "You're the man from the summit," Carlos said. "The one who laughed." Richard winced. He nodded. "Yes, I suppose I was." Carlos gestured for him to sit. A man who laughs at others is not always cruel. Sometimes he is afraid. The words pierced Richard like an arrow. He had come prepared to lecture, but instead he found himself stripped of armor. He studied Carlos, the rough hands, the tired eyes, the quiet dignity. It reminded him of his own father, long gone, whose voice he had silenced under layers of wealth. "Your daughter," Richard said softly. "She's extraordinary." Carlos chuckled weakly. "She is her mother's fire and my stubbornness. A dangerous mix." For the first time in years, Richard smiled without performance. He looked around the modest apartment, at the faded curtains and patched walls. And he realized something with startling clarity. Elena had already achieved what no amount of money could buy. She had built respect, hope, and resilience from nothing but grit. He, despite his towers of glass and steel, had built only walls around himself. That evening, as Elena washed dishes, Richard lingered at the door. "The offer in Brazil," he said, his voice low. "You're afraid of leaving your father." She froze, water dripping from her hands. "He needs me." Richard hesitated, then replied, "And perhaps he needs to see you become what he sacrificed for. A man can live with sickness, Elena, but not with the regret that his child never soared." Her eyes widened. For a moment, she saw not the arrogant magnate, but a man speaking from scars of his own. Elena lay awake again that night, but this time her choice felt clearer. Life was not a scale where love and ambition weighed against each other. It was more like a tree. Her father was a root, strong and buried deep. She was the branch, reaching higher. And sometimes branches must stretch toward the sun, not to abandon the roots, but to honor them. The decision was still terrifying. But fear, she realized, was simply the shadow that appeared before you stepped into light. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Wings!" The last day of the summit arrived with a kind of anticipation that felt different from years past. Guests who usually measure success by the number of deals closed found themselves talking instead about a young woman in a janitor's uniform. The story had spread far beyond the ballroom. She had become the spark of the entire event. Richard Lawson stood near the podium, staring at the rows of polished chairs filling with CEOs, investors, and reporters. For decades, he had been the one commanding attention, shaping the narrative. But today, his mind wrestled with an unfamiliar thought. Maybe the summit needed a new voice. The memory of Carlos Martinez's quiet dignity weighed on him. That visit to the small apartment had unsettled him more than Elena's fluency. For all his billions, Richard realized he had lost something Carlos still had: peace. And now, staring at the crowd, Richard knew what he had to do, back in her modest bedroom. Elena dressed not in her uniform, but in the only decent outfit she owned, a simple white blouse and navy skirt. Her father sat on the edge of the bed, watching with misty eyes. "You look like your mother," he whispered. Elena's chest tightened. "Papa, are you sure about this? What if I fail? What if I embarrass myself?" Carlos took her hand, rough against smooth. "Failure is not trying, and embarrassment is living small when you were meant to live wide. Go." With that, she stepped into the unknown. The ballroom filled quickly, cameras clicking, voices murmuring. Richard approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone steady but softer than usual. "This summit has always celebrated innovation, leadership, and vision. But sometimes those qualities do not come from the tallest towers or the largest portfolios." A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. "They come from unexpected places. Last night, I watched someone remind us what true resilience looks like. And today, I would like to give her the stage." Gasps, murmurs, and then silence as Richard extended his hand toward the side entrance. Elena stepped forward, her heart pounding. For the first time, she walked not as staff, but as speaker. The spotlight that once blinded her now illuminated her path. She gripped the microphone, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. "My name is Elena Martinez. My father is a janitor in this hotel. Last week, I was cleaning floors. Tonight, I am speaking to you, not because I was born into wealth, but because I refuse to believe that poverty defined me." The audience leaned in, captivated. "I speak 5 languages," she continued, "but languages alone are not my story. My story is that of a man who worked through sickness to give his daughter a future. My story is hours in a library, repeating words until my throat ached, believing that one day those words would carry me beyond these walls." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the room. "Some say money is the only language worth speaking. But last night, I learned something powerful: respect, dignity, and resilience. They translate into every language, and they can carry us further than wealth alone ever will." The hall erupted in applause, not polite this time, but thunderous. Some stood, Others cheered. Cameras flashed. Elena felt the sound wash over her like a wave, not drowning her, but lifting her higher. At the back of the room, Carlos Martinez sat in a chair Richard had arranged for him, his hands clasped tightly, tears glistening in his eyes. For once, the man who had spent a lifetime cleaning other people's messes watched as his daughter stood unshakable, commanding respect from the most powerful in the world. And Richard, who had built towers but lost sight of the ground beneath them, found himself clapping hardest of all. Weeks later, Elena boarded a plane for the first time in her life. The internship in Brazil awaited her. She carried one suitcase, a passport, and a heart both heavy and light. At the gate, her father hugged her tightly. "Remember me, Hidja," he whispered. "Wings were meant to fly. Don't be afraid of the sky." She smiled through tears. "I'll come back stronger, Papa. For both of us." As she walked down the jet bridge, she looked back one last time. Carlos raised his hand in farewell, pride radiating from every line of his face. And standing a few feet away, Richard Lawson watched too. His eyes met Elena's, and for the first time, his smile held no arrogance, only respect. The engines roared, the ground shook, and the plane lifted. Elena pressed her forehead to the window, watching the city shrink beneath her. "Languages are not chains," she whispered to herself. "They are wings." And at last, those wings had taken flight.